Now, this is a very, very interesting piece of scripture that the leaders of all the main Christian churches have selected for Trinity 14, dietary laws. And as background, I changed the suggested reading from the Old Testament and asked Bertolt to read from Leviticus 11, just to remind us what Jesus was brought up with, just to remind us what the first hearers of Jesus, who were Jewish, were used to. The readers of Mark's Gospel were clearly not all Jews, because Mark explains the Jewish teaching in chapter 7, verse 3. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, etc. He wouldn't have needed to do that had the audience been Jewish, which is why Matthew, when he tells this account, doesn't bother to mention that, because he's writing for a Christian Jewish audience. Mark is writing for mainly a Gentile, a non-Jewish audience. But even so, that audience, if they were interested in Jesus, would have been likely to have known about the Torah, about the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, which set out God's law. And they, as Bertolt read out to us, manifestly include specific laws and commandments about what goes into a person. There is no escaping that. So keep that at the back of your mind. Kosher isn't made up. Kosher foods are real. They reflect the dietary laws which observant Jewish people follow, laws which they sincerely believe to come through Moses from God. So what's happening here? In 7 verse 1, Mark makes the point that it's Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem who were questioning Jesus, and that's important. Because even if you were a Jew from the back end of Galilee, and Ilse will learn more about Galilee when she visits it as part of Semi's Europe in November, you would have to accept that Jerusalem is the centre of the faith. It is where the only temple of the Jews had been erected and beautified by Herod. There was no other temple which the Jews had, and the Samaritans, who had their own rival temple on Mount Gerizim, were cut off from the Jewish community precisely because they had a rival temple. Because the Jews only had one temple, and it was in Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed in AD 70 by Titus, who later became the Roman emperor. All that's left is the Western Wall, which is where Jews today congregate. So they came from Jerusalem because they were important teachers. They were people who knew the law. They were a good foil for Jesus, good opposition for Jesus. It makes it clear it's not just random local preachers who were disputing with Jesus, it is the experts. It is, may I say to Ilse and Sharon in this chapel, it is people like me. It is people who were thought to understand the religious tradition. So if Ilse is a bit shy in pointing out my errors, that's because of all the miasma of reputation which surrounds the senior clergy. And before we just fasten on me, I am not the only senior priest of the diocese in this chapel tonight. You can meet Simon after the service. So they're from Jerusalem, and they take issue with Jesus, and they say, "We have noticed that your disciples are eating in a state of defilement," that is, a state of uncleanliness. And they go on to say, "Why do you not accept the traditions of the elders?" It's a very odd phrase to us, but not to them. Because the Pharisees, their name means the separate one, but notice it's not just the Pharisees who are complaining at Jesus, it's the Pharisees and the scribes from Jerusalem. So it's not just some way-off sect, and the Pharisees weren't a way-off sect, they were a mainstream sect. It is the scribes, i.e. those who were so learned they could write and copy out the law. That's how learned they were, very unusual skill 20 centuries ago, to take issue. And what's happening there is that the Pharisees are those who particularly say that the 5 books of Moses, which are surely God's truth, are supplemented by a whole oral tradition, a spoken tradition, which has been handed down but not written. And the particular details of that are not actually in Scripture. They're in groups of oral sayings which were recorded thanks to the Pharisees, who wrote them all down in a book we now call the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was codified just a century or so after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And it's a sort of supplement, an appendix, if you like. It's the S numbers to the Torah, added to the hymn book, added to the Torah, which say, oh, by the way, if there's a difficulty over agriculture or diet or marriage or waging war, this code will explain it. And so indeed, as Mark says, it's full of particular directions about how to clean yourself before eating and how to clean your utensils, all good hygienic stuff. But it's laid down not just in Leviticus, but in the Mishnah. And the big debate is whether it is to be followed by priests or by all Jews. That's the big debate, but it's certainly there. So the Pharisees are there. Their name means those who are set apart, and they particularly follow not just the Torah, all 613 laws, absolutely, but this group of oral sayings, which of course they themselves gave the right to pass down across the generations. So they take issue. And what does Jesus say? Well, I hope we live now in a spirit of compromise. But I have preached many times from this chair or from that lectern about the fact that Jesus almost never compromises. And so he takes the people in front of him who are learned scribes from Jerusalem, the elite of Judaism, and local Pharisees, well known and respected for following the law to the very letter, and he calls them hypocrites. Hypokrites, as theologians know, is one of the words available in Greek for an actor, those who are putting on a show. And he quotes from Isaiah to say, yes, this is a people who pay lip service to the law, but not with their hearts. They replace the Lord's teaching by human ideas. It's a very, very strong criticism. And if ever you're wondering, why is it that the Pharisees didn't like Jesus very much? Well, here's a good example. Because they explain to him why they've got a problem with his disciples for not observing the written traditions held sacred by many Jews. And Jesus responds aggressively by saying, no, you're hypocrites. You're play acting. You're acting. You're not really worshipping God. You're acting. You're replacing my law, God's law rather, with human precepts about washing dishes. Now, if only Jesus had stopped there, it would be really, really easy in interfaith terms, because I could say, here is Jesus calling the people of Israel back to the Torah, back to Moses. Here is Jesus saying, forget these accretions. Here is Jesus, if you like, in Christian historical terms, being Luther. He's saying all these traditions are fake and hypocritical. Go back to the text. And that would be a really neat sermon, and you'd probably be pleased that I end it there. But hold up. That's not what happens next. And again, by my reverse probability law, I'm convinced that from verse 14 onwards, we are hearing the original teaching of Jesus because it is so shocking to the ears of those around him. Because Jesus, having criticized the Pharisees and the scribes for, as it were, diluting Moses and the law, the Torah, the law of God, by these human traditions about washing pans in particular ways, then goes on to issue himself a much more radical teaching of his own, much more destructive of the Torah. What does he say? Listen to me, all of you. So this is a teaching directed to all people, not just to the elect or those who understand or his own disciples. Listen to me, all of you, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile. But the things that come out are what defile. And again, very authentically and very credibly, this causes consternation amongst Jesus' own disciples. So when he'd left the crowd and goes into the house, his disciples asked him about the parable, and Jesus said to them, "Then do you also fail to understand?" No wonder they failed to understand, because in front of them, Jesus had just taken the Torah and turned it upside down, evacuated it of its traditional meaning, because what Bertolt read from Leviticus 11, he wasn't making up as he went along. The Torah is absolutely specific about what you can eat and what you can't eat. If you are an Orthodox Jew, you're not making it up. You don't eat horse meat, because the horse's hoof isn't cloven. You don't eat shellfish, because a prawn doesn't have scales and fins. Not because you don't feel like it, or it doesn't taste nice, because God has told you through Moses not to do it. That's clear. There's no escaping that. No, there are Jews who say, this is true, but I can't be bothered. I don't feel obliged to follow the Torah, or I'll limit it just to not eating pig meat as a sort of sign. But no observant Jew says, oh, this law isn't true, this law isn't valid. It's there in the Torah. And here is Jesus who says, whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, cannot make unclean, cannot be an abomination, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes out into the loo. Thus he declared, Mark says, all foods clean. So Mark spells it out. Thus he declares all foods clean. In other words, thus he declared that he was no longer a Jew. It's as shocking as that, really. How can you possibly come to any other conclusion about this teaching? And then he goes on to say, what comes out of a person, that's what defiles. It comes from evil intentions and the long list: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, lust, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. So there we have it. It really is absolutely shocking to the audience who first heard this. And in case the Gentile audience who are reading this, who are Mark's audience, don't quite get it, Mark spells it out. Thus Jesus declared all foods clean. And so it is that Jesus, in criticizing the Pharisees and the scribes, then goes on, shockingly, to place himself above Moses. He says, I, Jesus, am the one who tells you what you can and what you can't eat, and as it happens, you can eat what you like. What really matters is what comes out of you. Now, I, as a Christian, trust Jesus and believe it. But as a Christian, facing my Jewish colleagues and friends, I acknowledge that it is a difficult thing that Jesus says because it is so radical and revolutionary. It is extraordinary that someone like that survived for one more day without being stoned, because the insult to the Mosaic law is so flagrant. It's so outrageous. But there it is, recorded in our earliest gospel for us. So what do we make of it? And I thought, how can I possibly explain to the lovely flock of M&Ms what this might mean? And because we're all very learned here, I'm going to use as an example a very different person from Jesus, namely a Dane called Søren Kierkegaard, whose name is spelled Kierkegaard, it means churchyard, who was a philosopher, a Lutheran philosopher of the 19th century. And in reflecting on this and other passages, Kierkegaard tries to give a typology for how we come to where Jesus was. And he characterizes human life, especially human religious and spiritual life, in 3 stages, which I think survive a century and a half since Kierkegaard died, as a sort of explanation for how did Jesus end up here? And he uses different categories. He calls them the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. I'm going to rebaptize them. Kierkegaard begins by saying the essential human nature is basically selfish. We are born selfish. Many, if not most people, never get beyond that. They go through all their lives being egomaniacal, being selfish, and the fundamental rule they have is about pleasure. What will give me the most pleasure? What will meet my needs? The subtitle for this phase of human life, according to Kierkegaard, is me, 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 me. I remember once I preached in Holy Trinity, and as a sort of semi-joke in the middle of the sermon, I said, and now I'm going to turn from the Bible to my favourite topic, me. And there was a sort of frisson of pleasure and recognition across the very large congregation there, because people, quite naturally, including myself, can recognise themselves in that sort of joke. Me, my needs, my priority, my selfishness, that's what makes things work. And think about it as a spiritual exercise. How many of our prayers are actually selfish like that? It's all about me, what I need, what I want, what will serve me. So Kierkegaard says most people stick with that because it's nice, it's attractive. But some will move to the second stage. And the second stage I'm calling law. So rather than selfishness and me, you go to a system of law. You go to Moses. You go to food laws. You go to a code whereby you regulate your existence. So I have on, it shouldn't be there really, but on the altar, something which I'm given as a head of religion in Belgium. It is the Code of Civil Law in Belgium for this year. See how thick it is. And I open a parenthesis. I think many of the difficulties which the British government is experiencing with the European Union in negotiation are because the European Union functions on this level. There is a code written down, and you follow the code. And so if the British government says, can you make an exception for goods coming from the UK? Michel Barnier says, well, no, because we're following not quite this code, but we're following an EU code. So this, and in theory, I'm supposed to be familiar with its 2,000 pages as a head of chef de culte in Belgium, details what you do in the Kingdom of Belgium to get married, to sign a contract, employment, in cases of civil dispute over boundaries, and so on and so forth. It is a code civil. It is a full outline and detailed working out of how to behave as a Belgian citizen. And it restricts my behaviour. I might love the idea of moving the boundary fence between me and the flat next door by 3 meters to give me more space. You know, it'd be a really good idea. But this code stops that selfishness. I can't just move the boundary on my fence to next doors because it breaks the Code Civil. I might love the idea of taking 2 wives. It's a really good idea. It would probably be better for the 3 of us. Okay? But I can't do that because this code says you can't do that. Whatever your selfish desire for bigamy, Jack, it is not allowed in Belgium. And so for Kierkegaard, the second stage, a law, a legal stage, if you like a mosaic stage, is a big leap forward. Because rather than saying, me, 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 you say, no, I will submit myself to an external authority, an external law, and I will follow the law. Now Kierkegaard says, again referring to this passage and others, most people, as in almost all people, never get beyond that. Because that is interpreted as the summit of religion. Following the rules, following the code is the absolute top of what it means to be a religious person, and the proof of that is the Pharisees. The Pharisees said, yes, We are not selfish. We are following the Torah. We are following what would become the Midrash and the Talmud. We are following the rules. What more can be asked of us? We're following all of them, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and we're following them all. What more could possibly be asked? That is the summit of what it means to be a religious person. And Kierkegaard draws from Jesus' teaching here, no. There is a third phase after the selfish and the legal, or I might say legalistic, which he calls religious. I will call it faith. There is a third stage of faith in which the person says, I see the penny has dropped, that saying me works, but not at the deepest level. It certainly doesn't make you happy, Kierkegaard observes. It just makes you more selfish. And he sees the problem with the Pharisees, that saying, I follow the law, yes, well, that works well if you're a Belgian citizen looking at a boundary dispute, but faced by yourself and your neighbour and your God, it's not enough, because you can absent yourself totally from assent to that. You can follow a rule even whilst having contempt for the rule. So I really want 3 meters of my neighbour's garden, but I obey the rule unwillingly because I have to, by obligation. Well, Kierkegaard says, what if you go deeper into yourself? And rather than saying me, and law, you say faith. Faith. What would it mean for me to follow Christ's teaching here? What would it mean for me to say, it's not enough to say I avoid bacon sandwiches. It's not enough for me to say, well, I never eat shellfish, and if everyone else around the table is having a seafood pizza, I have nothing. Look at that virtue. I follow the law which Moses has prescribed on behalf of God Almighty. What if you follow Jesus and say, no, let's go inside and wonder about what's coming out, what my intentions are, what my motives are, what animates the faith, what's going on deep within. Because all of us know, and I start with myself first because how could I not, that in part all of us are actors. And I begin with myself. At least a proportion of my public life and my private life and my life as an Anglican priest is in part an act. And I begin by acknowledging that. It's important for those who are following on, like Ilse and Sharon, that they see that. For those who are more experienced, acknowledge that within there lies that hypocrisy, that sense of feeling obliged to criticize or feeling obliged to praise because it conforms with what's legalistic. So, go back 50 years, an Anglican priest in England would have been obliged to say to a couple who came for marriage who were already living at the same address, no, that will not do. That will not do at all. You must not do that, you must do something else. Okay? As a matter of course, as a matter of form, as a matter of following a rule. But let's look at what Jesus asks us to do, to go inside and work out what the motivations are. Now, I am the first to acknowledge that is a difficult process. Quick example. I used to be the headmaster of an Anglican school in Cambridge, in England, and here's one rule, which is absolute, which was on Monday morning assembly, the entire school would come to assembly wearing their blazers, wearing their jackets. This rule had no earthly purpose. It was there because it was a rule. And what was intriguing to me is that when I would upbraid the boys and girls of the school for bullying or cheating or stealing, they would argue with me about that. But over this random, pointless rule, I mean, it's June, it's hot, you've been in the playground, you've been playing football, you're sweaty, and you have to put your clammy, heavy woolen coat on in order to hear Dr. McDonald drone on about the Bible for 10 minutes, like I'm doing now. Okay? And if you didn't, you were given detention. But not one pupil in 3 years ever complained about detention if he or she came by mistake to assembly without wearing a jacket, because they would say to themselves and to me, it's the rule. We follow the rule. It's dead easy. It's really easy. You follow the rule, you're okay. You don't follow the rule, you're not okay. Jesus gives us a much harder task. It's not enough to follow the rules. Jesus has some problem with the rules. He says they're wrong. We have to go in. We have to look at our motivation. What is it that drives us? Why are we doing this? Who are we in relation to ourselves and to God and to our neighbour? These are much harder than putting your jacket on to go to assembly. Imagine if I said to my 15-year-old lads and lasses, before coming to assembly, you must write me an essay on who you are. Every Monday. Well, of course, the whole school would have broken down in disorder because it's just too hard and too personal and too difficult. But that's the task which Jesus sets us. If we are to follow him, we must go beyond selfish. We must go beyond legalistic and arrive at faithful. We must dip into the depths of our own selves, work out what's going on, and why we're producing the fruits we're producing. Why are we producing lies? Why are we producing licentiousness? Why are we producing theft? Why are we producing lust? Why are we producing cruelty? Why are we producing all these sins that Jesus outlines? Why is that happening? And that is a task for me and for all of us as we go through our lives. And it would be an impossible task because we very soon end up with some very unpleasant conclusions about ourselves. Except the command to do this, to go beyond selfishness and law to faith, as Kierkegaard outlines, is said by the very same person, Jesus Christ, who is the one who loves us, who cares for us, in whom we live and move and have our being, who meets us this evening in the broken bread and the shared wine, who accompanies us and loves us and blesses us as we go through that life of self-examination. And that gives us some confidence.